Okay, good morning, everyone. We mentioned last week that we would talk a little bit about anti-Semitism. So what we're going to do today is we're going to look at three different passages from the actual Torah itself, which I believe gives us some context and some background to how we view the whole idea of anti-Semitism. And after that, perhaps we'll kind of build and take it a little bit of a step further and make it a little bit more practical. So now we're just the goal is to zoom out, so to say, and look at it a little bit, just three stories in the Torah from a little bit of a different, bigger perspective. So the first thing that I want to show you is actually on the very first verse of the entire Torah. And for those of you that are at home, I'll share the screen so you can look in, and so you can look at it itself. So on the very first verse in the entire Torah, the first verse of the Torah says, Bereshis, in the beginning, bara Elokim, God created, et hashamayim, ve'et haaretz, and the heaven and the earth. So there's a Rashi on this first verse, which is quite something. And you'll see in a minute what I'm talking about. All right. Here we go. Here we go. All right, so hopefully those of you at home can see this by now. And you can see the Rashi that on this very first verse, so on the very first verse, on the very first Rashi, those of you that are in person, you don't necessarily have the translation of the Rashi in front of you. But nevertheless, you have it where it says classic questions. You see over there where it says classic questions. So Rashi begins with the following question. He says, he's quoting Rabbi Yitzchak, and the question that he's coming to address is, why does the Torah begin with the story of creation? The Torah should have started with the first mitzvah. The first mitzvah that all of the Jewish people received was the mitzvah of Rosh Chodesh, of sanctifying the new moon at the beginning of every single month, which is mentioned in Exodus, in the book of Shemot, chapter 12, verse 2. So this is the first Rashi. Now remember, Rashi is like the kind of most famous commentary on the Torah, became at least, and really to explain the Torah on the simplest, most basic way of understanding. So the first comment that he makes on these words, that in the beginning God created heaven and earth, is he quotes this midrash that says that Rabbi Yitzchak was bothered or asked the question, why did the Torah start with the story of creation? The Torah should have started with the first commandment that the Jewish people received as a nation, which was this idea of Rosh Chodesh. What's behind this question? Because the main purpose of the Torah is not to tell history, is not to give us, a nice story. The main purpose of the Torah is to be a book of lessons, a guide. The Rebbe would point us out countless times that the word Torah, we call it the Torah, in Hebrew spelled Taf, Vav, Resh, and Hey, is similar to the word, what you would call in Hebrew, a teacher. Perhaps you remember from when you were in school back in the day, right? You had a mora. That means, right? Or your grandkids, your children have teachers. It's called mora this. So the word more or mora, depends if it's male or female, is similar to the word Torah, pretty much the exact same thing. And it comes from the same root word, because the word Torah means an instruction, like a teacher. The whole point of the Torah is to be a book of lessons, a guide how to live. It's very important to remember this when we're reading the Torah. And the Torah is not designed to be just a history, is designed to be a history book. You know, if the Torah was to be a history book, it's kind of weird because just to give you a little bit of a historical perspective, from Adam till Noah, from Adam, the first man created, Adam, till Noah, who's the second famous person in the Torah, is 1,000 years. And that takes up one out of the 54 Torah portions. So 1 out of 54 Torah portions is 1,000 years. The next 1,000 years takes up also only 1 out of 54 Torah portions, because from Noah till Abraham is another 1,000 years. So the first 2,000 years of recorded history in the Torah, from creation till Abraham, takes up 2 sections out of 54. What's 2 out of 54 percentage-wise? 4%, right? Somewhere around there. So 2,000 years is a very small part of the Torah. Then once we start getting to Abraham, time slows down a lot. Abraham's life is told in somewhat, not so much, somewhat great detail. Although interestingly enough, we're only introduced to Abraham at the age of 75 years old, when he's 75. And, you know, we learn the story of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, etc., slowing down. Now, the vast majority of the Torah is taking place over a 40-year period, because the Jewish people are in Egypt. That takes up some space. Then when we come out of Egypt, that's the majority of the Torah. The majority of the Torah is from when we left Egypt till the passing of Moses. In fact, the Torah is 5 books, right? The 5 books of Moses. The entire 5th book of Devarim, Deuteronomy, from a time perspective, is only 37 days. It's a 37-day speech that Moses gave to the Jewish people. It's the book that we're currently studying. So from a historical perspective, the Torah is not really teaching history in great length. It's jumping around, it's skipping around. In fact, in some cases, we know that the Torah is not even in chronological order. On occasion, the Torah will actually go out of chronological order. So all of this goes to show that the Torah is not about telling history. The Torah is about a guide, a lesson, a way to live. And even when the Torah tells stories, we're supposed to look into those stories and see how to live from those stories. As it famously says, Maise Avos, the actions of the fathers, Siman Labanim, are a sign for the sons. So that which the forefathers did, that became, a sign for how we're supposed to live. So with all of that in mind, we get to the beginning of the Torah, and the question becomes, why did the Torah start with the creation? Torah should have started with the first mitzvah, that there's an instruction to sanctify the new moon, to sanctify time. It's interesting in general the way the Torah has so many commandments that are connected to the sanctification of time. Time is a very precious thing, right? You have to be aware of when it's a new month. So that's the question that Rabbi Yitzchak asked. Now let's see, what was the answer? What were you going to say?
I was wondering if you were asking rhetorically to get our opinions on it, or were you leading into?
So this is the question that Rashi is quoting from Rabbi Yitzchak, and I want to show you what his answer is, and you'll understand why I'm introducing the class today with this idea. So this is what Rabbi Yitzchak says. The reason why the entire Torah started with the story that God created the world, that in the beginning Hashem created the world, is because the Torah wants to tell you that Hashem is telling us his strength, and in the future there are going to be nations of the world that are going to accuse the Jewish people of being thieves, of being robbers. What are they going to accuse us of stealing? They are going to accuse us of stealing the land of Israel. And what are the Jewish people going to answer when the nations of the world, because when the Jewish people entered the land of Israel, there were 7 nations that were living there, and we kicked them out. So when the people say, "Oh, you're robbers, you're thieves, you kicked out the 7 nations and you stole the land," we are going to answer them that look what it says in the Torah: the entire earth belongs to Hashem, belongs to God, because God created it. Look in the Torah says God created the world. And he, Hashem, God, gave the land of Israel in the beginning to whom he wanted. And then he took it away from them and gave it to us. So the entire reason why the Torah started with the story of the creation of the world, Bereshis, in the beginning, God created heaven and earth, is because one day there's going to come a group of people that are going to say to the Jewish people, "What are you doing in the land of Israel?" Does this sound familiar? Who are you to claim houses in Jerusalem, right? Who are you to claim certain parts of the land which they're calling, occupied territories or disputed territories? They're going to say to you, you stole it. And what's a Jew going to say? A Jew's going to say, what do you mean I stole it? Who created the world? Hashem. God created the world. Bereshis, in the beginning, God created the world, and everything in the earth belongs to him. He originally chose to give it to one group of people, and then he chose to take it away from them and give it to the Jewish people. This is the first Rashi on the Torah, which is very telling. Anybody that wrote a book knows that the way you're going to open is going to be a big thing, right? You spend a lot of time figuring out how you open. The beginning is very important. The beginning sets the tone for everything. So straight away in the beginning of the Torah, we see from this Rashi that we're already addressing a question, the fact that the legitimacy of the Jewish people's claim to the land of Israel is going to be questioned, and the Torah is giving us the way in which we're going to answer. We're not going to say Israel belongs to us because a bunch of people in 1948 decided that it belongs to us. We're not going to say that Israel belongs to us because some British dude, many years ago decided that we can have some of his land because he's tired of being there. That's not why the land of Israel belongs to us. And that's why it doesn't matter who's living where. The fact is that the whole entire land of Israel belongs to the Jewish people, even if we're not temporarily occupying every single part of it. The land of Israel belongs to us because Hashem gave it to us. The entire world belongs to Hashem. And he chooses who to give to what. What do you think about this comment from Rashi?
My first thought when you were saying why was that it was to establish Hashem's power.
Right.
I didn't think it far enough to connect it.
Which makes what Rashi is saying even more incredible, because the answer that you're saying, Carolyn, is saying that God is starting the Torah with the creation of the world because he's establishing his strength. He's establishing his position. He's like, okay, I'm the boss of this place, and now you're going to listen to me, which is a perfectly legitimate answer and perfectly makes 100% sense. But what's incredible from this Rashi is how Rashi takes it all the way specifically to the land of Israel. Because you could have given a very simple answer. Of course, God started the Torah with the creation of the world because he wants to tell you who he is and why you should listen to him. But that's not where Rashi takes it. Rashi takes it and no, there's going to be a dispute over the land of Israel. And your claim to the land of Israel is going to be because God gave you the land of Israel. So, when we talk about this concept of anti-Semitism and different claims that the Jewish people have done things wrong, etc., you already see this in the Torah kind of being foretold from so long ago. And the other interesting thing that you see is the way in which a Jew answers. Fine. This was just the first piece that I wanted to kind of put out there, that based on this Rashi, this interpretation from Rashi, the entire reason why the Torah began with a story of creation, and it didn't begin with the first mitzvah, with the first commandment, because the Torah wants to tell you that one day there'll be a dispute over the land of Israel, and the Jewish people are going to answer, we're not thieves because God created the world and he gave what he wanted to you, then he took it away and he gave it to us.
Rabbi.
Yes.
So I read a book, and one of the commentary by the author was that when the Romans came into Israel and said, we need to tax, the Jews need to pay tax on land, many of the Jews said, no, this land doesn't belong to you, it belongs to God. Therefore, we can't do what you want. And so the mighty Roman army said, oh, yes, we'll show you. And they took it over. So I suspect that when Rashi says the land will be in dispute, he probably meant many times it's going to be in dispute.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And, even when it was taken over by the Romans or those kinds of things, we also believe that came from Hashem. You know what I mean? That for temporarily, Jews had to be exiled from the land or whatever it is, but that doesn't, make it not ours. But yeah, I'm using the example of nowadays, the dispute that we have over the land, but 100% it's been in dispute so many different times, and it's been at the front and center of Jew hatred for so many, for so long.
Yes.
What was it called when the Christians were on their way to Jerusalem? The Crusades, which they killed thousands of Jews along the way. In some shape or form, it was about the land of Israel also. That's what they were crusading towards. Now, not saying this is the only idea behind anti-Semitism and the only thing, but I thought it was kind of an interesting idea to see that already from the beginning of the Torah, with the commentary of Rashi, he's kind of reading into it that there will come times of dispute, and many times, and times of arguments, and how the Jewish people are going to explain or answer why the land belongs to them. All right, that's piece number one. Piece number two that I want to go to comes from the life of Avraham, and just to see a couple of interesting things, that when it comes to the life of Avraham, obviously, as you all know, had two children. One of them was Yishmael, who was birthed from a woman called Hagar. And the second was a son called Yitzchak. So just want to look at a couple of different of the verses and the passages and this relationship between Avraham and his own son Yishmael, between the relationship between Yishmael and Yitzchak. And again, I think this will give some perspective to kind of see what was the origins of the Jewish people and some of the enemies or the counterbalance, if you will, that God created in this world. So those of you that are sitting in front of me, if you want to turn to page 87. And those of you that are online, I am going to go to the next chapter. All right. So here, over here, the Torah tells a story that Abraham was 99 years old, and God appeared to him. So at this point, he already birthed Yishmael. Yishmael was already 13 years old at the time. So he's 99 years old, and God appears to Abraham. God says, I'm going to place my covenant between me and you, and I will multiply you very greatly. Abraham fell on his face, and God began to speak to him. And God told him as follows, verse number 5. This is on page 89. So So God told him as follows: your name is no longer going to be Avram, but now your name is going to be Avraham. What does Avraham mean? He says, for I have made you the father of a multitude of nations. So God already told Abraham that from you is going to come many nations, not just one nation. Doesn't say clearly that they're not going to get along, but that's what happened, right? But here already we see that part of the covenant with Abraham was that Abraham was going to be the father of a multitude of nations. Many nations are going to come from him. I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make you into nations, and kings will emerge from you. Rashi tells us right there in verse number 6, I'll make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make you into nations, and kings will emerge from you. This is referring to the nations of Israel and the nations of Edom, in addition to the nations of Ishmael that are going to come from Ishmael, because God was now telling him that he would have a second son who would be Yitzchak, Isaac, and from Isaac was going to come Yaakov and Esav, which were the nations of Israel and Edom. But God is prophesizing him already that he's going to have a multitude of nations that are going to come from him. So it's interesting that already from the early days of Abraham and the covenant that he had, God was foretelling him about these different nations that he was going to have, and this is the place where God tells him he should have a circumcision, and Sarah's name is not going to be Sarah anymore. Well, her name was Sarai, and then God changed it to Sarah. And God says, I'm going to give you a son. And Sarah, you're going to have a child with Sarah. What did Abraham say immediately? Verse 17, you can see that on page 90, I believe. 93. 93. Top of 93. So God says to Abraham, you're going to have another son with Sarah. So Abraham says to God, for me, it will be enough if Yishmael will live before you. So if Yishmael would live to be righteous, that would be good enough for me. Did you notice that's what Abraham said to God? God says, I'm going to give you a second son with Sarah, because Abraham at this point was 99 and Sarah was 90. So God says, I'll give you another child. And Abraham says, you know what? I'm old already, and Sarah's old. I don't know if I could handle another one. So he says, if only Yishmael will live before you. In Hebrew, Lu Yishmael yichya lefanecha. You ever heard an expression, halavai? It's similar to the Hebrew word that's used over here, which means lu, like it's really the same thing. Halavai, Rashi uses that word. Halavai. He says, if Yishmael will live before you and he will walk in your ways and he will fear you, that will be good enough for me. But God says in verse 19, no, Sarah will have a child and you're going to name him Yitzchak, you're going to name him Isaac, and I'm going to establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his seed after him. So God says, no, it's not going to be with Yishmael. The covenant that I'm making with you is going to be carried out through your son, Yitzchak. And as far as Yishmael goes, don't worry, I'll bless him as well, and I will make him fruitful, and I will multiply him exceedingly. He will beget 12 princes, and I will make him into a great nation. So you already see that Yishmael is prophesied to be a great nation. So when you look around and you see others, you were talking about before about the Romans or different things, other great nations, it doesn't come as a surprise to a Jew. How come other people are given power? How come we're not the strongest in them? No, already from the beginning, God's promising that there'll be other nations that are going to be big and powerful. All right. Then we learn the story how Abraham gives himself a circumcision and he has a child, etc. And then we know the story that eventually Yitzchak, Isaac grows up a little bit, and him and Yishmael are in the same house. And Sarah says to Abraham, you have to send Yishmael away. He can't stay here and live. He's being a bad influence on Yitzchak. And Abraham doesn't want to, but eventually he agrees, and he sends Yishmael away. And if you remember the story, when Yishmael was sent away, Yishmael got very sick, and his mother Hagar put him down to rest, and the angel appeared. Maybe we can look at this inside. I'll show you the story in 1 second. So the story is it's after the destruction of the whole story of Sodom. And then, of course, Yitzchak is born. All right, so it's on the Chumash in front of you. It's on page 119. Chapter 21. All right, so we go to chapter 21, and here we go. So basically, Abraham says, Sarah says to Abraham, I want you to send Yishmael away. He's being a bad influence on the child, on my son Yitzchak. And Abraham doesn't want to, but God says that you should listen to Sarah, your wife, hearken to her voice. For in Isaac will be called your seed, verse number 12. God says it's through Isaac that's going to be your primary, that's how we're going to continue. But Abraham didn't want to send away his son. Anyway, he sends him away, and they go, and they ran out of water. So now it's just Hagar, the mother, and Yishmael, the son, and they run out of water, and he's very sick. And an angel appears to Hagar. And an angel, this is verse 17. An angel says, why are you worried? So she says, and the angel says, don't be afraid. And in verse number 18, it says, rise, pick up the lad and grasp your hand upon him, for I shall make him into a great nation. Yes. So it's interesting that in some of the commentaries, they say that Yishmael and Yitzchak got into a fight. What was the argument about? Yishmael said that he is greater in terms of his devotion to Hashem, to God, because Yishmael was 13 years old when he had a circumcision. We just finished learning the story that Hashem told Abraham when he was 99 years old to have a circumcision. At that point, Yishmael was 13, and he also went along with the program. He also had a circumcision. So Yishmael said, I'm greater because I was I was mature, I was understanding, and I willingly, with an understanding, gave of myself to Hashem. Yitzchak was 8 days old when he had a circumcision. He was born after Abraham was circumcised. He was only conceived after Abraham was circumcised. And when he was 8 days old, Hashem, God instructed Abraham to circumcise his son. So nobody asked, he didn't have any understanding of what was happening. So Yishmael said, I'm much greater than you are, because you didn't give anything. No one asked you. You didn't understand what was going on. Me, I understood. I did it willingly, etc. And over here, we also get to something, a very deep point, which is this idea that a Jew's connection to Hashem, a Jew's existence, is beyond logic, is beyond what makes sense, which almost seems like the reason why Hashem waited for Abraham to reach an age which was impossible to have a child. God's like, okay, if I'm going to build a nation from you, we're going to build it in a miraculous way. So he waits till Abraham is 99, till Sarah is 90. It's impossible. No one ever has children with a man of 99 and a woman of 90 years old. That's not possible. So God waited for them to become impossible age, and says, when it no longer makes sense, then you're going to have a child. In other words, a Jew's existence from the beginning didn't make any sense. And that's kind of this discussion between Yishmael and Yitzchak. Yishmael saying, to me, my relationship with Hashem, my existence, it makes sense. It's an existence which is, doing my best to do things which are logical, make sense. And Yitzchak is the idea that it goes beyond logic. And really, when we talk about all this anti-Semitism and everything, a Jew's existence is a proof of Hashem's existence. Why? Because a Jew's existence doesn't make any sense. And I'll say that again. A Jew's existence is a proof of Hashem's existence, because a Jew's existence doesn't make any sense. As the Midrash says, the Jews are compared to one lamb that's surrounded by 70 wolves. Now, one lamb cannot survive surrounded by 70 wolves. So the only reason why the lamb survived is because great is the shepherd that protects the one lamb. So in a similar vein, the Jewish people, our existence doesn't make any sense. And the only reason why we're still around is because of Hashem is protecting us. And therefore, our existence becomes a proof of Hashem's existence. Right? When you think or you look at a Jew and say, how does a Jew survive? You had the Romans, you had the Crusades, you have this, you have that. Doesn't make any sense. There's only one way that it makes sense. And that is because of the great shepherd that protects us. But what we're seeing over here is this is already the plan from the beginning. God waited to give birth to Yitzchak, which we see so many times. It says, I'm going to build the nation of the Jewish people through Yitzchak specifically. God waits till it makes no sense to have a child. Says, give him a circumcision at an age which he cannot make that choice, because I want to show you that the relationship runs deeper than that which makes sense. You cannot unchoose it, because it's something which is deeper than anything. And therefore, a Jew walks the planet Earth, and it's a living proof of Hashem's existence, which is one of the reasons why it bothers other people so much. Because when you see the Jew, you see Hashem, and when you see Hashem, that's a reminder that there's something bigger than you, that you're responsible for, that you can't do whatever you want, and then you get bugged. If I get rid of the Jew, I get rid of the reminder of Hashem. If I get rid of the reminder of Hashem, I can do whatever I want. So the second thing that I wanted to point out to you is this story of the birth between Yitzchak and Yishmael, which are also, again, now you're creating already this tension. You already see the creation of this tension between Yitzchak and Yishmael. They were fighting from such an early age. Yishmael had to get kicked out because they couldn't get along. And they both come from Avram. They both come from Abraham. And God promises Abraham that you will have many nations that are coming from you. Yishmael is going to be a great and mighty nation. And we're already seeing a promise that Esav also is going to be a great and mighty nation as well. And then the other piece that I wanted to point out from this whole story is that you see the existence of Yitzchak, which is the birth of the Jewish people, to be a supra-rational, this idea that doesn't make any sense. And because it doesn't make any sense, that's why it becomes a proof of Hashem's existence. When Yitzchak was born, everyone understood that it was a miracle. When you looked at Yitzchak, you said, okay, his father's 99, his mother's 90, and people questioned it, and God made miracles that he should look identical to his parents, and people were able to recognize that this was the child of Abraham and Sarah. So when you looked at it and you saw this child that didn't make any sense, there was only one explanation for it, which was, it must be it's from Hashem. So from the earliest stage and the earliest age, Yitzchak, and by virtue of that, the Jewish people, we are pointers to Hashem. And that's why people get so bugged by us. All right, let's take a look at one more story, also a story that you're familiar with, but part of the bigger picture of anti-Semitism. I think this one is going to be very important to understand. The next story that we're going to look at is the story of the birth of Jacob and Esau. So one interesting thing is that Abraham had these two children, Yitzchak and Ishmael, but they were actually from two different mothers. So same father, but two different mothers. Now, when we get to the birth of Jacob and Esau, they were born both to the same father and to the same mother. And not only that, but they were twins. So they later on develop into these two nations, which kind of represent these two powers, as we're going to see in a few minutes. But they were conceived from the same parents at the same time. They were twins, which kind of really goes to show, how closely related these two powers are. So let's take a look. This is from the Torah portion of Chayei Sarah. That's not going to talk about, okay. So this is the beginning, the Torah portion of Toldos, page 157 in the Chumash in front of you. All right, so the Torah tells us the following story. That Yitzchak was 40 years old when he married Rebecca, who was the daughter of Besuel. All right, and the Torah tells us who he was. And then the Torah tells us that Yitzchak and Rivka were childless. They didn't have any children. So what happens? Yitzchak begins to pray. Why was he praying? Because his wife was barren. So he prayed, she prayed, and verse 21, the Lord accepted his prayer, and Rebecca, his wife, conceived. What happened? Says the Torah, and the children struggled within her. So she's pregnant now, but she feels this struggle that is taking place inside of her. Which is a very strange verse because the Torah doesn't say anything. It doesn't explain who was struggling and why they were struggling. Just says that she conceived, and then the next verse says the children struggled within her. So Rashi says a very interesting thing, that the word in Hebrew for struggling comes from the word ratz, which means to run. And what was taking place was, that whenever Rivka, the mother, would pass by a house of, a house of Torah study, then she would feel movement inside of her. And when she would pass by a house of idol worship, she would also feel movement inside of her. So she became very concerned because she didn't know, as we're going to find out, that she was pregnant with twins. And then she said, if there's one child inside of me, how come they're drawn to both holiness and unholiness? So she was in a lot of pain. So she went to speak to the prophet. It says in the verse, and the Lord said to her, and Rashi explains, through a messenger whose name was Shem, and he explained to her that she was pregnant with twins. But he didn't say it like that. He said there are two nations in your womb. There are two nations in your womb, and two kingdoms will separate from your innards. So you're pregnant, but there's going to become two nations. One kingdom will become mightier than the other kingdom, and the elder will serve the younger. Now, if you see Rashi over there, where it says one will become mightier than the other kingdom, Rashi says they will not be equal in greatness. When one rises, the other will fall. It's like a seesaw, right? When one is up, the other one is down. I shall become full from the fine. So already from day number one, they were prophesying there's going to be two nations, and the way these nations are going to work is that when one is strong, one is weak. So this should give you already a little bit of an understanding of what's going to happen in the future of the Jewish people. When the Jewish people are up, then one is strong and one is weak. When the tide turns, it's the other way around. It's the other way around. Which you don't have to look very far in history to see how that works. At some point, Jewish people were the powerful ones, and things were fine. The nations of Esav were calm and quiet at our feet, and then it switches the other way around. The nations of Esav become the powerful ones, and we become the ones that are in trouble at their feet. What do you think about this story?
Well, I've heard it before, of course, I've studied it before, but not in terms of thinking about anti-Semitism.
Right.
The start of it, and it falls in place now, and especially in relationship to the other two passages we've studied this morning. Very interesting.
And we know how that's, to your point, how the story continues, because the story continues that Jacob and Esau don't get along, right? From a very young age, they have two completely different paths, and Jacob takes the blessing, and Esau wants to kill him, and Jacob runs away, and, they do meet back up again, but they never become brothers that are, seeing eye to eye. And one of the things that's interesting is that when Jacob goes in to take the blessings, so if you remember that story, Isaac, the father, was blind. So Jacob, with the help of his mother, puts on like goat skin on his hands because Esau was very hairy. And Isaac, he says the following words. So a son comes in, he's blind, the father, he feels his hands, and he listens to his voice, and he says, Hakol kol Yaakov, the voice is the voice of Jacob, v'hayadayim yedei Esav, but the hands are the hands of Esav. And one of the commentaries over there explains that, so literally what he was saying was, when I'm feeling the hands, I feel the hands of Esav, but the voice sounds like the voice of Jacob, so he was confused. Which one of his sons came inside his room? But the idea runs much deeper than that Hakol kol Yaakov, the voice is the voice of Jacob. A Jew's strength always comes through his voice, through prayer and through Torah study. By Yadayim, and hands are the hands of Esav. So already from the beginning, we have Esav being the fighter, the archer, the man of the field, and Jacob is a man of the tents. That's what it calls him. He's much more of the studious type, the academic, so to say, which also has played itself out throughout history. Jews were never known for their, military might, perhaps, which is not to say that the Jew is supposed to be weak. This is kind of the complex that we all walk around with, that are we supposed to be, But at least the Jew has been famous for his academic, being more a man of the voice. But the idea over there is that Hakol kol Yaakov, the voice is the voice of Yaakov, and the hands are the hands of Esav, because a Jew knows, to tie it back to what we were saying before, that his existence has always been a miracle and dependent on Hashem. So therefore, he's not going to survive the way Esav survives. He needs to recognize that it's going to be dependent on his voice, and his connection to Hashem. So we know that from Esav descended the whole nation of Amalek, which is kind of the quintessential enemy of the Jewish people, is Amalek.
The grandfather of Amalek or the father?
The great grandfather. From Amalek came Haman in the Purim story. We know is a descendant of Amalek. So here we have that Jacob and Esau from day number one were these, when one is up, the other is down. When the other one is up, the other one is down, etc. Kind of this seesaw, if you will. When one nation is strong, the other nation is weak. When one nation is strong, the other nation is weak. So it's kind of.
The right is up, the Jews own. If the right is down, the Jews owns.
From day number one, we already see this idea that it was built in, that there was an enemy or an opponent, which doesn't come as much of a surprise. One of the ideas that I mentioned a minute ago was that a Jew's existence has always been miraculous, because that gives us the opportunity to be a proof about Hashem's existence. And there's another idea as well, which is that God made a world which has holiness and unholiness in it. In order for us to have choice, there has to be good and bad. If we were created as the chosen people, and God would have created a covenant with Abraham, and there would have never have been any struggle, or there would never have been any reason to question this, that wouldn't have given anybody any, that's not going to present any free choice. Then it would be obvious and so simple to embrace the idea of being God's chosen people. But from day number one, when God created this power of good, he also created this power of evil, because there has to be balance in the world. And that's why from the very beginning, they were conceived in the very same womb, the good and the bad, the Jacob, the Yaakov and the Esau, because that's what keeps everything in balance. If you just have Jacob and everything is going his way, and no power given to Esau, so then there's no balance in the world. The balance in the world comes because, there's these two. With this in mind, knowing that the creation and the birth of Esau is to kind of create the balance, it's not evil. They too have a purpose to serve. And when Mashiach comes and there's the rectification, there's the of Esau, then they too will come and serve Hashem. But so long as we haven't gotten to Mashiach and the world has to be a balanced world between good and evil, then we have these two opposing forces. I want to finish just with one last thought, which is that, in the last couple of weeks, we've been talking a lot about the Beit HaMikdash and the destruction of the temple and everything like that. So in Rome, there is an Arch of Titus, and in the Arch of Titus, you see that all of the depictions of the Jewish people going into exile and carrying away all of the different vessels from the temple and all the different things. And somebody once made a very interesting observation that if you look over there, you don't see any depictions of a Torah being carried away or a Torah being destroyed. So the Arch of Titus was supposed to be the last drawings, or the last, whatever we're called, of this ancient people called the Jewish people. Like the Romans came, they destroyed the temple, they kicked out the Jewish people from Israel, and that was going to be the end. So they said, okay, well, let's do a couple of drawings so people will know, a bunch of years ago, Jewish people lived in Israel, and here's the Arch of Titus, and people can go to Rome and look at this ancient people called the Israelites that once upon a time lived in Israel. And of course, it never happened, because here we are. But on that arch, there was no Torah burning or Torah being carried away, because what they didn't understand is that the true power of the Jewish people comes from the Torah. It's not a geographic thing that holds us together. It's not even a temple that holds us together. It's the power of the Torah that holds us together. So it's a very interesting observation, because, when we talk about the origins of the people, the origins of the Jewish people and the way other people perceive the Jewish people's existence is a miraculous existence, and it's an existence which is attached to the Torah, and therefore we've been in all the different places and all the different times and all the different, Jews have Ashkenazi Jews and Sephardic Jews. Ultimately, it's the Torah that's keeping all of the people together and the people as one. So it's just a fascinating observation to me, because this Arch of Titus was supposed to be, the depictions of this nation that's once lived. But what they didn't realize is that it has nothing to do with physical buildings or physical locations. It's the Torah that's making the Jewish people, and that you can never take away from the Jewish people. But be it as it may, from day number one, the Jewish people have always had a rival. You see that in the story of Yishmael and Yitzchak. You see that in the story of Jacob and Esau. It's always been that way. God created that world, but there's this balance. The existence of the Jewish people was always a miraculous existence, and it's kind of built into the fabric of the world, where the legitimacy or the specialness of the Jewish people is being questioned, all the way from the beginning, and in a way that has to be that way. There has to be balance. And the fact that there's other nations that are strong, we already see God promising that to Abraham. It's not a surprise to anyone. When Rebecca was pregnant with his twins, it says, Shnei goyim bevitneich. There's two nations in your womb. And they're going to come two mighty, strong nations. So hopefully these three pieces just from the Torah, the idea that the creation of the world, the Torah starting with the creation of the world, Rashi already says, is to allude to the fact that one day people are going to complain against us for taking Israel. When looking at the story of the birth of Yitzchak, you already see that it's kind of, so much of the story of his birth is connected or compared and parallel to the birth of Yishmael, who was born in a natural way, who had a circumcision at 13 years old, who couldn't get along with Yitzchak from day number one, but nevertheless, God promised will be a strong nation. And moving on to the birth of Jacob, who was conceived at the very same time as Esau. And Esau is the forefather of Yishmael, of Amalek, is the forefather of Haman and everything. And the two of them were created at the very same moment. And from the beginning, from the very same seed, they separated into two nations that would be one up against the other. And, moving on to the statement that the voice is the voice of Jacob and the hands of the hands of Esau, the Jewish people's existence is miraculous, because it's a sign that it's the proof of Hashem's existence. And therefore, as we're going to continue talking about this, the answer to the anti-Semitism is always to recognize this and to embrace this and to hold tighter to it. The fact that it's, the Jewish people we are who we are because of the Torah, and the fact that our existence is a proof of Hashem's existence. As I said before, we're one lamb amongst 70 wolves, and the only reason why it exists because of the shepherd. So if the lamb turns his back on the shepherd, then what chance does he have? The more the lamb is willing to recognize the existence of the shepherd, who has the capacity and has the ability to chase off all the 70 wolves, as history has proven, and the more we're willing to say the land of Israel is ours because God gave it to us, that is our answer to anti-Semitism. And in the more of the practical elements, please God, we'll get to in the future weeks.